Over 3 years. That's how long Ukraine has spent waiting, planning, choosing the perfect moment to get revenge for a war crime that shocked the entire world. It was Vladimir Putin who ordered the infamous butchers of Bucha to kill scores of Ukraine's civilians during the first few weeks of the war. Now Ukraine has just delivered justice. The butchers of Bucha have been eradicated. And Ukraine did it by pulling off a spectacular covert operation more than 4,000 miles deep inside Russian territory. The details we have about Ukraine's stunning strike are scant, which should come as no surprise when you learn that it was the main Directorate of Intelligence of Ukraine, or HUR, that pulled it off. The secretive organization isn't about to give away too many of its secrets, as the more information Russia learns, the harder it is to complete future operations. But what we do know is that HUR managed to infiltrate some of its operatives into Russia at some point before September 8th. Those operatives had their sights set on a Russian National Guard unit based near Khabarovsk, which is almost 6,500 kilometers, or around 4,030 miles, away from the Ukrainian border. This was a dangerous mission. If the HUR operatives had been discovered, there would have been no escape. Over 4,000 miles is a lot of distance to cover to get back to safe territory, and it's almost guaranteed that Russia would have been able to hunt those operatives down. But HUR's people weren't discovered. Instead, they pulled off a strike that took down the National Guard unit and in the process extracted revenge against a group of Russian troops that Ukraine has been hunting for years. You see, this wasn't any National Guard unit. The unit Ukraine just destroyed was home to the butchers of Bucha. We'll explain why these particular soldiers were such a massive target for Ukraine in a moment. First, UKR Inform provides the limited details that we know about what Ukraine managed to pull off on the morning of September 8th. The outlet says that it spoke to an anonymous source inside HUR who told UKR Inform that HUR specifically targeted Russia's military unit 6912. That unit belongs to Russia's 748th Separate Operational Battalion of the National Guard, which the Kyiv Post says open source data has revealed took part in the horrors that took place in Bucha back in 2022. The source told UKR Inform that operatives working inside Khabarovsk managed to plant a pair of explosive devices in a parking lot near the unit's base. At around 9 a.m. on the morning of September 8th, those explosives were triggered right around the time that the unit's soldiers were reporting to their base for duty. The perfect timing of the strike meant that the explosions hit the Russian soldiers as they were making their way from the parking lot into their building, maximizing the damage caused in the process. As for how much damage was caused, UKR Inform's source is reluctant to provide full details. All they would say is that there are several dead or wounded, all of whom are personnel serving in the Russian military. That's all we know about the strike itself. In its report, the Kyiv Post repeats the information shared by UKR Inform, while adding that its journalists haven't been able to independently verify that the strike took place. And unlike with the many long-range drone strikes Ukraine uses against Russia, images and footage of this attack haven't been shared on social media. That makes sense. It's a lot easier to shoot videos of drones flying through the skies and smoke pouring into the air due to industrial facilities being on fire than it is to capture any proof of a shock strike against a Russian military unit inside that unit's base. So how do we know that the strike happened? Beyond UKR Inform's sources' claims, Russia itself may have revealed that something went on that nobody expected to happen. There has been no official statement from Russia. Again, that isn't a surprise. Putin isn't about to allow any of his people to confirm that Ukraine just managed to pull off a covert operation 4,000 miles deep into Russia's territory. However, the actions that Russia took following the strike tell us all we need to know. According to United 24 Media, Russia's security service arrived to shut down mobile internet access in the area surrounding Khabarovsk almost immediately after the strike happened. This is a common Russian tactic whenever Ukraine lands a heavy blow on its territory. According to journalist Georgy Shentemirov, who spoke to the Barents Observer on August 29th, Russia's official reason for what are becoming more common and widespread internet shutdowns is that closing off the internet helps the country to deal with Ukraine's drone strikes. Only this is one of the rare instances where a drone isn't involved in one of Ukraine's attacks. The truth is that drones use several systems for navigation, and I'm not a specialist in that topic, but as I understand, it's an open question if these shutdowns help to interfere with drone attacks or not, Shentemirov says. But it is 100% clear that drones use different types of tools for navigation. In other words, shutting down mobile internet networks isn't going to do a thing to stop Ukraine's drones, so there has to be another reason why Russia does it. The real reason is that Russia shuts down internet service because of an ongoing crackdown that involves foreign-made internet and messaging apps. As the Moscow Times explained back in July, this crackdown has led to the introduction of fines against anybody discovered accessing what the Kremlin nebulously calls extremist content online. Steps have also been put in place to prevent access to certain social media platforms and foreign websites. It's not hard to put two and two together here. Whenever Russia is attacked, it shuts down internet access in the appropriate region. It does that not because it wants to guard its people against Ukraine's drones, but because not having internet means the Russian people who might have recorded an incident can't jump on social media to immediately share what they've seen. It's all about preventing information from leaking out, with the Moscow Times adding that these shutdowns may also be part of an ongoing effort to advance a sovereign form of Russian internet that prevents any sort of access to websites and apps that the Kremlin deems unsuitable. Russia is trying to control the narrative around whatever happened in Khabarovsk. That desire for control suggests that something very serious, such as the destruction of an entire Russian military unit perhaps, has just happened. Beyond the internet shutdown, United 24 says that Russia took steps to alter public transport routes in and around Khabarovsk. Again, it's the familiar Russian pattern in action. If public transport isn't making its way through the settlement, people can't find out about anything that may be happening there. If people can't find out, they can't report what they see, whether they be to friends, family, or the world at large via social media. It's all about preventing Russians from finding out the truth. And when Russia takes these types of steps, it's practically guaranteed that something major has happened. Let's assume that UKR-informed source is delivering accurate information, and Ukraine has just pulled off what must stand as one of the most daring clandestine assaults yet seen during the war. The most surprising thing about the whole affair is that killing Russian soldiers with a pair of explosives deep inside Russia isn't the real headline of this story. That honor belongs to the people that Ukraine targeted. We mentioned earlier that HUR's explosives took out members of the infamous Butchers of Bucha. However, for anybody to understand why that's such a massive thing for Ukraine, they first need to know what these butchers did. The details are harrowing. Going back to April 1st, 2022, UKR-Inform reported on what the unit Ukraine just targeted did in Bucha. Forced to withdraw from the Ukrainian city by a resurgent opposing force that had pushed Russia's invading troops out of several settlements, the unit would become known as the Butchers of Bucha didn't go quietly. Instead, they laced mines into civilian buildings and infrastructure, none of which could be considered legitimate military targets. The purpose here was clear. The Butchers were trying to kill any civilians who dared make their way back into Bucha after the Russian soldiers had withdrawn. Russia's mines were devastatingly effective. Just 10 days after UKR-Inform's report, the BBC shared satellite images detailing the carnage that Russia's troops left in their wake. Merely knowing that mines were in some civilian buildings wasn't enough for Ukraine's military to deactivate every booby trap that Russia left behind. But beyond the mines, there was what Russia's soldiers did before they were forced to withdraw. The satellite images the BBC shared came from March 19th, 2 weeks before the order to withdraw was given, and they show the outcome of a massacre. Bodies lined the streets of Bucha along multiple stretches of road, with another image, this time from March 11th, showing that those bodies had been there for weeks. Russia's troops hadn't just tried to take the city, they systematically slaughtered hundreds of civilians while doing it. Russia, of course, tried to claim that the many photographs emerging from Bucha after Ukraine retook the settlement weren't real. Ukraine had placed fake dead bodies in the road, with the whole affair supposedly being staged. But that wasn't the truth. The Kremlin knew that, and it didn't care. What happened in Bucha was the first, and perhaps still the most devastating, example of Putin's willingness to allow his troops to commit war crimes if it means he can come a step closer to stripping Ukraine of its sovereignty. The death toll was astonishing. According to Babel, Ukraine had completed the sad act of counting the dead and establishing what really happened in Bucha by August 2022. The final death toll was 458 Ukrainians, almost all of whom were civilians. Of the 458, 419 died in incidents that were in connection with military actions. This means they were killed using weapons. The rest were determined to have died of natural causes. As terrible as this information was, it was made worse by the sheer callous disregard that the Butchers of Bucha showed for the bodies of those they killed. In one instance, Ukraine's investigators discovered 116 bodies that were buried in a mass grave on the hallowed grounds of the Church of St. Andrew I called, Babel reported. That fact served as a spit in the face of the deceased. Not only were they killed in a clear war crime committed by Russia, but they were buried en masse in a place of worship that many of them would have frequented. Tragically, it's up for debate whether this or the fate of the 50 people who were simply left on the streets to rot, unburied, is worse. There were attempts to punish the Butchers of Bucha, of course. In June 2022, Al Jazeera reported that the European Union, or EU, had named and blacklisted a pair of Russian military commanders, one of whom was a butcher among butchers. Azatbek Amurbakov was accused by the EU of leading his soldiers as they killed, raped, and tortured civilians in Bucha. However, the response to his actions was the best that the EU and later the UK could muster, given their lack of direct involvement in the war: sanctions. Amurbakov was named on a list of 26 high-profile Russians placed under sanctions, though it's not really clear what these sanctions were supposed to achieve. Presumably any foreign assets Amurbakov had were frozen, and he wouldn't have been allowed into any EU country, but that seems like paltry punishment, as does a mere sanction in general for a commander who was responsible for such death and destruction. As far as we know, Amurbakov was still alive on September 8th. Ukraine certainly hadn't announced his death, and it certainly would have had it managed to strike such a high-profile target. Now the question has to be asked, was Amurbakov caught up in the pair of explosions that racked the parking lot of Military Unit 6912's base? If he was, HUR isn't revealing that information just yet. But even if he wasn't, the fact that some of the butchers of Bucha were among the dead means that Ukraine has finally gotten some small measure of revenge for the 458 people who were killed in Bucha by Russian soldiers during an occupation that was little more than a war crime. We saw a small measure because it's unlikely that Ukraine has killed every one of the butchers of Bucha. As we mentioned, we don't know Amirbakov's fate, and there were other units involved in what happened in the city that Ukraine will likely want to target. But with this strike, it killed Russian soldiers who were about as far away from Ukraine as they could possibly be. Khabarovsk is closer to China than it is to Moscow, being not that far from the border. So Ukraine has just sent a message to every Russian soldier who was involved in Bucha: nowhere is safe. Ukraine can hit you no matter how far you can run. Beyond the outcome of the strike itself, the fact that Ukraine was able to pull off an attack over 4,000 miles beyond its own borders proves that Ukraine's deep operations are getting both deeper and better. The butchering of the butchers is far from the only time that Ukraine has sneaked its operatives into Russian territory. Back in June, Ukraine's brilliant Operation Spiderweb involved members of HUR driving trucks filled with drones into Russia. Those trucks were stored in warehouses, again likely secured by Ukrainian operatives working inside Russia, before they, and the drones they contained, were unleashed on 4 of Russia's air bases. Ukraine has also been targeting high-profile Russian figures inside Russia itself with attacks that the BBC calls increasingly brazen since 2024. For instance, Lieutenant General Igor Kirillov was killed by a remote-controlled bomb stashed in a scooter inside Russia in December 2024. A year earlier, Ukraine likely took out a prominent war blogger named Vladlen Takarsky, who died after a supposed art student gave him a sculpture of a soldier's head that exploded as Takarsky was placing the piece back into its box. These kinds of assassinations are becoming fairly common inside Russia. Ukraine doesn't claim responsibility for any of them due to their questionable legality, but that's besides the point. What really matters here is that Ukraine has spent the last couple of years growing very comfortable with the concept of sending covert operatives into Russia to pull off attacks that Putin and his cronies never see coming. And Ukraine may be getting help from an unexpected source to carry out these attacks. In January, ABC News reported that 2015 saw Ukraine's Lieutenant General Valery Kondratyuk visit Washington, D.C. to speak to U.S. intelligence agencies. His goal was simple: to convince those agencies to start working alongside Ukraine in the wake of Russia's first campaign of aggression against Ukraine that resulted in the illegal annexation of Crimea. To aid him in his question, ABC says, Kondratyuk presented US intelligence with luggage stuffed to the brim with secret Russian documents, showing that he was serious about this being a collaboration, rather than a one-sided affair from which Ukraine alone benefited. It seems the gambit paid off. Kondratyuk's visit to Washington was part of a remarkable story: how since 2014 the CIA and Ukraine's intelligence services secretly forged a deep partnership, transforming them from Cold War enemies into one of the US agency's most trusted partners, ABC says. A former US official who spoke to the outlet said that this meeting, combined with the work Ukraine and the US have done together since, took Ukraine from zero to one of our most important partners. The CIA ended up being directly involved in helping Ukraine to rebuild HUR into what it is today, which means that every operation HUR carries out has the CIA's fingerprints all over it. That doesn't necessarily mean that the CIA provided the intelligence Ukraine used to know just how to strike the butchers of Bucha that it just took out. But HUR learned from the CIA, and given how deep the partnership between those two agencies now runs, it's not outside the realm of possibility that the CIA may have had some involvement in what happened on September 8th. Of course, the CIA would never reveal that involvement if it did, neither would HUR. But the prospect that the US and Ukraine might be collaborating on these types of deep strikes inside Russia's territory will frighten Putin, as will the fact that Ukraine has once again pulled one over on Russia's own intelligence agencies by pulling off such a successful strike. For its part, Russia may be happy that nobody is speaking about what happened in Khabarovsk beyond one unnamed HUR source. That at least allows it to try and hide the truth, as it always does. Strategic disinformation is part of Russia's warfare strategy, Global Rights Compliance said in May. The organization reported on a report that revealed that Russia had already used around 100,000 social media pages to spread disinformation, along with military bloggers who have a global audience of around 10 million to spread its disinformation. Russia will have to rely heavily on that network now that Ukraine's version of what happened in Khabarovsk has been revealed. Ukraine won't care. HUR isn't going to give away its secrets just because Russia is burying its head in the sand and pretending that some of its butchers of Bucha haven't just been blown to pieces. The organization will simply keep on going. Khabarovsk was a success. Now, the odds are that HUR is already deep into the planning process for the next operation that will cause Russia to lose some of its most valuable and most brutal soldiers. Putin is one man who will be very upset about what just happened in Khabarovsk, and he should be. While what HUR just pulled off is one of the more prominent examples of covert operations affecting Russia's military, there are plenty of others. For instance, a Ukrainian soldier pretended to be Russian, and what happened next was brutal. Discover what that soldier did in our video, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more coverage of HUR's latest exploits in the fight against Russia. And thank you as always for watching.